The evil
All the victims
murderer
were slashed to
lives.
death.
Is this Jeremy Irons doing the VO?
With a knife?
No, it sounds crazy, but it looks like they were killed with a giant pair of scissors.
The giant scissors
Run!
once again
Run!
search for prey. A trail of terror stretches across Europe, from Norway to England.
Jeremy Irons, that has to be you for sure.
Here it is, the Barrows Mansion.
Oh, that's a piece of paper.
Go there and look around, but we'll never solve the mystery of Scissorman.
You've got to be joking. It's way too dangerous.
What's the joke, old
As
man?
long as he's alive, we're not safe anywhere, Doc.
One after another, the horrifying murders continue.
Oh! Oh, not the chandelier, no!
Who will make it through this game of murder alive?
Yeah!
Tower.
Clock Tower! Welcome back to... What an intro, guys. Can you imagine anything more cinematic than the setup for Clock Tower for PlayStation? Or otherwise known as Clock Tower 2 in Japan. We won't get into that because it gets unnecessarily confusing. I covered that in the previous video. So this video is something that I've been waiting for, and hopefully you've been waiting for it too. I promise I'm not gonna rap. I'm gonna spare you guys. So Clock Tower for PlayStation may not be remembered for its graphics or its writing or its gameplay, but it certainly will be remembered for its atmosphere. And in an era when kids say things like mood and vibes, Clock Tower was exactly that. It was all vibes. Where Clock Tower Super Nintendo laid the foundation for the story, in Clock Tower 2, we're reintroduced to the final girl, Jennifer Simpson. It's been 1 year since the grisly murders at the Barrows estate, and Jennifer Simpson has survived and is living in Norway. She's been adopted by a criminal psychologist named Helen Maxwell, and then the murders start happening again, and all signs point to Scissorman. But how is he still alive? And it's up to you, the player, to unravel that mystery. Heavily inspired by the giallo and slasher movies of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I would argue that Clock Tower for PlayStation is the definitive slasher game of the 90s. What I find particularly interesting is that Clock Tower was released in Japan in December of '96, and then a mere week later, Scream came out in theaters in the States. Scream was one of the most influential and iconic movies of the 90s. It was a film where Wes Craven, who was already considered to be one of the masters of horror, reinvented himself for an entire new generation. And while Clock Tower didn't quite deconstruct the genre like Wes Craven's film did, it did take what was great about the original Clock Tower, and it went even darker, scarier, and even more cinematic, thanks to the PlayStation's 32-bit processor and enhanced sound chip. So in my mind, Clock Tower was to survival horror what Scream was to the slasher genre in the 90s. It was one of a kind, and nothing was quite like it when it released. The game's director Hifumi Kono at first had no interest in developing a sequel to Clock Tower, but since the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation were already on the scene, knowing that he could make a 3D version of the game was all he needed to greenlight the project. And as a horror movie fan, we love our sequels. I mean, you get a chance at more kills, more gore, more lore and world building, and moreover, a chance to top what you did in the original. And Kono and his team at Human Entertainment, which was roughly about 30 employees or so, did exactly that. They did everything that they could to top the original Clock Tower for Super Nintendo. Around the time of development, Resident Evil had come out, and graphically that game influenced and inspired Clock Tower. It pushed Kono to strive towards more realistic graphics. The cool thing about this game is you don't just play Jennifer, you can choose to play Helen Maxwell. There are scenarios where you can play Gotts, the police detective on the case, or Nolan, a reporter. As I said in my first video, Clock Tower for PlayStation was one of the first horror games I had ever played. And at the time, I was young, but I was already a huge fan of horror movies. The story about me browsing my rental store and finding that game, that amazing, horrifying cover, Yeah, that was all I needed to suck me into it, and it made me want to rent the game. And I will say that when you compare the original Clock Tower to Clock Tower 2, back then the graphical difference was miles ahead of its 2D predecessor. And that is what really likens Clock Tower to a classic slasher film, even a classic horror film franchise like Nightmare on Elm Street or the Friday the 13th series. Because you have a killer that's relentless. He picks off his victims, you've got the final girl, and no matter what, he is indestructible. He can't die. He keeps coming back again and again and again. And that's how it was in Clock Tower 2. For example, in one instance when you're playing Helen in the Barrows Castle, you open a door only to reveal that it's a huge drop into the ocean, and while Scissorman is pursuing you, he falls all the way down, and you would think that he would be dead then, but no. Scissorman is pretty much invincible, just like all of our classic horror icons. And just like all those classic horror movies, the only way to stop the evil entity known as Scissorman is through an otherworldly or supernatural force, which in this case is a spell that puts his evil to rest. As the game continues, and people continue dropping like flies, you're led to the Barrows Castle in England, the origin of this horror. And it's up to you and the choices that you make as to who lives and who dies. And will you have what it takes to defeat this sinister force, or will you end up being another victim of Scissorman? As we near the 30th anniversary of Clock Tower 2, I still feel wholeheartedly that it's the most terrifying game of that decade, and it is the definitive slasher horror game of the 90s. It's got everything: murder, suspense, horror, anxiety-inducing chases, and haunting music. Sure, the gameplay is dated, I will agree to that, but there's something charming about that PlayStation 1 era. And I do see people nowadays say how some of those games were scarier than the newer games, and the reason was because of the technical limitations at the time. You had to go for more atmosphere than detail and graphics, and it's because of that lack of detail that makes things all the more scary, where your imagination has to paint in between the lines. And there is absolutely nothing more terrifying than what your mind can conjure up. I can't recommend playing this game enough, especially if you are a horror movie buff or a survival horror fan, especially a retro survival horror fan. It doesn't take that long to beat, maybe 2 hours. And there are so many indie horror games out now that live in the shadow of Clock Tower, and that you can tell are hugely influenced by it. Thank you for watching my video on Clock Tower PlayStation, and now you know why I consider it basically a 90s slasher movie in video game form. If you like the video, like and subscribe, and hope you're excited for the next one.